Hey everyone. So this was just like I just tossed this together. It was a early like video I did where I just really was trying to learn how to do video editing, and I was trying to learn how to do audio with video and so on and so forth. So it's just old and it's just out of date and it's very sporadic and kind of vague, and I don't even think it really gets to the point, but I had it on my computer and I was like, why would I waste this? Like, I have it. So I took a lot of time making it, and I'm not gonna just let it go to waste. So here's my little mini documentary of what it was like growing up with 90's comic books. Enjoy. So let's start at the beginning. I was born in 1987, but I probably wasn't conscious of anything going on around me till 1991. And that's when my dad finally gave me my first presents and basically my inheritance for my life, which was comic books. The comic books he grew up with as a kid. And they blew my fucking mind. Starting with issue 184 of the Fantastic Four, probably the earliest comic I remember reading. George Perez's art truly was fantastic. And to be quite honest, it still blows me away even today. Had as a kid was actually Jack Kirby stuff as well, like Captain America, the Mad Bomb issue, or Devil Dinosaur, one of Kirby's most overlooked works. And then there was the Eternals, although I think the reason he bought this issue of the Eternals was for a specific character. In fact, probably his favorite character of all time. Because in this issue, the Incredible Hulk makes an appearance. And the Incredible Hulk was definitely my dad's favorite character in the Marvel Universe. And boy, did he have a bunch of those issues to hand to me. And I'm glad he did, because as a kid, this made me appreciate the Incredible Hulk even more in understanding one's anger. Then there was Jim Shooter and Sal Buscema on the Avengers. Howard Chaykin, Chris Claremont, Archie Goodwin on Star Wars. Who can beat that? Of course, he also had an abundance of Marvel 2-in-1s, which I'm guessing he felt was a steal. The Invaders, Guardians of the Galaxy, a series obviously part of Toho, the Godzilla comic books, Iron Man, and apparently my dad was a Marvel fanboy instead of a DC one, as you do not see one DC comic here, because he bought a slew of Fantastic Four, written mostly by Roy Thomas and drawn by George Perez. And of course some Len Wein Spider-Man. So those were the comics I grew up with. Of course, that was just at home, and that was just what was given to me. There was also the comic book shop. The shop we used to frequent was called Atomic Comics. My dad and I spent a lot of time in here. You know, the thing about comic shops back then is that they were in abundance, so you could find them everywhere. In fact, I remember going to like at least half a dozen comic shops within the span of like 4 to 5 years. Comic books were everywhere. And my dad and I used to spend a lot of time walking around the comic book shop just gazing at everything. They had posters, trading cards, action figures, statues. I mean, it wasn't just comics in there. And you could spend a lot of time just looking at stuff, just being amazed. It was almost like the Blockbuster experience, except for it was comic books. But my dad kind of decided what we read and what he thought would be best for me as a child. So what he would let me do while he looked at all the new comics on the walls is he would say, "Hey, you see this row of long boxes here, the 50-cent ones? Go ahead and have fun, kid. Get like 10, 12 comics. They're only 50 cents." So that's what I would do. And I realized something early on when I did this. And that was that issues followed chronologically one after the other. And sometimes there were miniseries. So what did I do? I thought, well, I'll start with a miniseries and chronologically get everything from issue 1 to the last issue. And that first thing, of course, was Millennium. Now, DC's Millennium was actually a good start for me because it introduced me to basically the whole Justice League and all the characters of the DC universe. So while people may frown upon things like this, miniseries or, stuff like this that didn't quite get up there as big as the other things, they actually weren't bad for a kid my age, and I still appreciate Millennium today for that reason. I'll have to talk about it someday here, but I think the thing I appreciate most in my early former days, when I was learning about comic books, was at nights when my dad would read to me. Those will definitely be some of the moments that I cherish for the rest of my life. Because, look at it this way. While everyone else was off reading their Little Red Riding Hood, I was learning about the 5-in-1 threat called the Quintronic Man and watching him beat up the Hulk. You had Goldilocks and the Three Bears? That's cute. I got to watch Spawn mutilate and brutally kill Billy Kincaid. Or finally get to see the Batman's back break. We truly had it all back then. Of course, then comic books got so popular, they ended up becoming video games. couple comic book video games for the arcades. God, I loved X-Men arcades so much. Of course, it didn't stop there. Next thing you know, you're going to the movie theaters and you're starting to see that comic books have finally made their way into other forms of media. Maybe most notably, we would see the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comic book by Mirage Studios get turned into 2 full feature-length films, TMNT 1 and TMNT 2, Secret of the Ooze. Even if some of these things were coming from pulp fiction from long ago, they still would be able to see themselves enter into the movie arena, having been comic books, most notably The Shadow, Dick Tracy, and The Rocketeer, one of my personal favorites. But comic books hadn't found their ground yet. A perfect example of a bad movie would be the Captain America one. A better version wouldn't appear until way later. Then, after following the success of the Batman film in 1989, Tim Burton would obviously do Batman Returns, followed by Joel Schumacher's Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. The most notable thing about this is that it gave us Batman cartoons that would turn later into more Batman comic books. Then you have your British science fiction comic books becoming movies. And further down the line, you have the odder comic books like Tank Girl becoming comic book movies. And then you have tragic books like James O'Barr's The Crow, where he had lost somebody he loved and wrote a comic book about it. And that comic book was later turned into a movie starring Brandon Lee, who tragically died on set during the production of the film. Going back, I don't think most people know that James O'Barr's Crow was a comic book before it was a movie, which is kind of tragic in its own right. Also, the character Eric Draven was based off of Iggy Pop in some way. Can you tell? Then you have these weird cases where Marvel was going to go bankrupt in the 90s, and they started selling off some of their comic book properties to studios. Most notably, the biggest one was the Fantastic Four. And the Fantastic Four had actually gotten their own movie in the 90s where the studio wanted to keep the rights of these characters indefinitely. So what they would do was make a movie and then just not release it. Of course, there was bootlegs, but this Fantastic Four tragically never saw the light of day until way later. Which is sad because I enjoyed it. And you should too. Doom demands it. And then something cool happened. One of my friends actually had a pretty cool superhero movie on VHS tape back in the day. This was a superhero of color, known as Blade. Blade actually first appeared in Marvel Comics all the way back in July of 1973. He was the brainchild of Marv Wolfman and penciler Gene Colan, and he appeared all the way back in issue 10 of Tomb of Dracula. So it was interesting to see this character generate his own movie in the 90s, and not only do that, but have sequels to follow it. Then there were comic books of the past, and I mean the past, coming back, and not only coming back in full force, just as comic books, but they were also getting their own TV shows and their own movies. And not just the movies, but cross-platforming also into awesome video games with great soundtracks as well. God damn, that's such a catchy tune. And then in the void of things, there were these very violent comic books that became movies. And not only did they become movies, but the movies were so popular that they became cartoons. And the cartoons were so popular that they became comic books of the cartoons that were popular because of the movie that was based off an originally violent comic book. I know, it's all a little maddening. But there's one last thing I do want to talk about when it comes to the comic books and movies, and that's the surprise. The surprise when you watch a movie and you had no idea that it was a comic book. And one of those few cases happened to me. That was when Men in Black came out. And maybe Men in Black is just not your typical idea for a comic book. It's not something you would think of when you think comic books. And maybe that's why it caught me off guard. But I've always appreciated it. And I think one day here I'll probably review it. Oh, and there was also an animated series, but of course there was. It was the goddamn 1990s. I mean, everything was about pushing it further and further. I mean, how far could you push one IP into any other platform, or even on the same platform? A good example of this would be some of the comics that were being pushed out in the 1990s, when the great comic book boom happened. See, people thought that buying all these #1 issues was going to make them rich, and then later on in life they could just retire and sit back on the profits of them. But that's not how comic books work. Especially when you're selling millions of copies of single-issue comic books. But the industry got wise to this and thought that they could just shit out any crap they wanted and people would buy it. These would later become known as gimmicks. Some of these gimmicks were things like foil on your comic book image, 3D foil covers. Now, I was a victim to a lot of these as a kid, certainly with all those titles on it. Oh wait, comes with a poster of Spidey, Silver Surfer, and Captain America? Oh my god! You know what? This poster is actually pretty legit. Ah, damn it, they got me again. Well, anyway. I mean, back then, some of the biggest creators were Rob Liefeld on New Mutants, Jim Lee on X-Men, and Todd McFarlane on Spider-Man. Getting back to those gimmicks again, they started to do things like put out multiple covers of just one issue. Like Jim Lee's X-Men. Well, here, just let Jim tell you.
Also, the covers line up to make one larger image. This is getting a little tricky.
Oh, that's great.
It's one of these.
You want me to help you?
Yeah, it's one
Where
of
does
these,
this one go?
Right,
This would be one picture.
Right. There's one more cover, and
there's probably something in between these two.
No, it's supposed to line up. I think.
It does, because there's the horizon line of the rocks, and it comes together. You're absolutely right. These line up.
Right.
That's great.
Multifunction comics.
Yeah, that's great.
Jim Lee's X-Men was really the premier comic of the 90s. And not only that, but it was the biggest selling comic of the 90s. It sold over 5 million copies. So if you're looking for something out of the 90s and you want to know what the biggest thing was, this was it. There were still a couple more gimmicks to be had, because that wasn't the end of it. Oh no. They would also put these comic books in bags. Pre-packaged comic books in bags. All over the place. And inside of these bags, they tried to stack them with cards. Trading cards. Can you believe it? Critics are hooked. Hook? Oh. It turns out, though, that wasn't enough for Jim Lee, or Todd McFarlane, or Rob Liefeld, or any of the others that left when they realized that they were selling a lot of comic books, but they weren't getting everything that they felt they should get. And what they do, they decided to go off and form Image Comic Books. See, Image Comics changed the name of the game because it was now free for people to come in with their own creative identities and publish the product, and no longer would the company own it. The creator would. And Image's founders were Eric Larson, Rob Liefeld, Todd McFarlane, Mark Silvestri, Jim Valentino, Jim Lee, and of course Will Spartaccio. These comics, however, were a little bit of varying quality. I mean, these guys changed everything. They changed the entire game, and it finally gave creators the chance to do whatever the hell they wanted. So, I mean, good or bad, you know, gimmicks aside, all the weird stuff, all the things that they tried to do in the 90s, whether it be in other forms of media or comic books themselves, the industry is still alive, still kicking, and it's never going to go away. I can foresee that now. It is too good to do so. And it all starts back at the beginning. Back when I was reading those comics in the 90s, or I was reading the comics that my father gave me.